This is the Artemis podcast. We're your co-hosts, Annita
and Paige. There's no one definition of a sportswoman,
but we're here to explore the stories of the million ways to be one
and how sportswomen are leading the conservation movement.
Pivet Ashev. I'm Annita Lucchesi, and Pivet Ashev means hello in my Cheyenne tribal language. Today, we are talking with Vanessa Castle, a Lower Elwha Klallam angler, mother, fisheries advocate, and conservationist. Vanessa shared with us about her nation's experience undamming and healing their ancestral river in Washington, the cultural and social impacts of tribal fisheries, the ways tribal communities throughout the Pacific Northwest have resisted colonial environmental policy, and how restoring salmon heals a community. I hope you walk away as inspired as I was after hearing Vanessa's powerful words. Well, hi, Vanessa. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I'm so excited for our listeners to get to learn from you. Can you start us off just with introducing yourself and sharing anything that you'd like to about some of your professional and personal experience in hunting and fishing and in environmental work, and kind of what you're bringing to this dialogue today?
Absolutely. Eampton Snatch at Vanessa Claims, and I am Vanessa Castle, or Eampton, and I am a member of the Lower Elwha Klallam tribe here in what is now Port Angeles, Washington. And my village is at the mouth of the Elwha River. I grew up on the Elwha River hunting and fishing from a very young age. I was raised outdoors, fishing with my mother, who was a commercial fisherwoman on the Elwha River, which then shifted to saltwater fishing because of our dams and the lack and decline of salmon. I got to see over my lifetime the salmon declining, the dams coming out during our dam removal project. And then to return to fishing 2 years ago after working for Natural Resources as a natural resource technician, collecting data and science within my usual and accustomed area, and just kind of throwing myself headfirst into the environmental and earth's world. I am a tribal engagement coordinator for Ridges to Riffles, working on the Willamette River Restoration Project. Through the dam removal project, we learned to collaborate with other people, including other Indigenous tribes that were working and fighting for their water and their salmon. And so through that work, I was recruited to come and help the Willamette Basin to elevate tribal voices into the world of restoration and making sure that we're doing Indigenous-led restoration. And then I also work for Panthera Conservation Organization. It's a global organization that works on cats worldwide. And I work on something called the Olympic Cougar Project, working with mountain lions in the Washington Olympic Peninsula area. And my title there is Cultural Science Conservation Coordinator.
Awesome. That sounds like incredible work. And I'm so excited to hear more about it. One thing I wanted to ask you about more, because I think you described it so beautifully in our previous conversation. You described it as like passing the paddle in terms of your work, from working in your own home community and on your own home river to now transitioning to supporting the Klamath River tribes. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit more and what it means to you as an Indigenous woman who's seen river revitalization firsthand, and being able to share that expertise and that lived experience with other tribes elsewhere.
When we removed the Elwha dams, it was a very scary time because we knew very little going in. It was the largest dam removal project for a long time until this last September, when we literally passed the paddle. I participated in a ceremony where I commissioned a skipper's paddle from one of our canoes, and got to hand it over to the women of the Ridges to Riffles to represent passing the skipper's paddle of restoration to the Klamath Basin and the people of the Klamath. And so during that time, we passed on a message that we've been skippering this canoe of restoration for a while now, and we are excited, and we stand with you, and we're in this canoe with you, fighting for salmon and for Indigenous rights and people. And I hope to be there one day when you pass this on to the people of the Snake River. And so that message was carried forward, saying, we're passing you this paddle, and you have an obligation to continue to uplift and support and collaborate with Indigenous peoples for the greater good of all salmon. And they took that so beautifully. And that was what started to build our relationships.
I love the idea of like indigenous conservation science and best practices being really rooted in cultural practices of diplomacy and knowledge sharing too, which is what you're describing.
It was quite a roller coaster of emotions. From the time the Elwha Act was passed in 1992, I was very young, I was 7 years old, to getting tied up in court for years, for 20 years. We didn't take out the dams, even though there was an order saying that that was the only thing, the only reasonable thing to happen to the Elwha to restore salmon. And so when the dam started coming out, it was this monumental celebration, tears of joy, celebrating, breaking bread together. And we were ecstatic as people. You could feel the energy in our community that we were so excited for this to happen. And then after the dams came out, which was a long process, a couple of years, 4 years for the larger one, the grief set in, the grief of the loss of our salmon and the moratorium. We placed a voluntary moratorium on the river for our people, but there was a moratorium placed for everybody. The tribe agreed to the moratorium because we wanted to give the fish the best case chance of survival. And so we didn't fish for 10 years. And one thing that we didn't talk about during that time is the impact of restoration on our cultural spirituality, our practices, our identity as Indigenous peoples, and the generational gap it created during that time period when we weren't fishing. When I heard about the Klamath dams coming out, the Klamath biologists came up here and they met with us, and I had a real conversation about what that looked like for us and made sure that I expressed, like, make sure you take care of your people that you work for. These biologists. And I said, make sure you remember why you're doing it. Because a lot of the times it's, as scientists, because I'm in the scientific world as well, it's so easy to get wrapped up in the data that you often forget about the people connected to the environment in that ecological system. When we got to go down to the Klamath, I got to bring my son. I'm a mother, and my son is 6 years old. And he got to see the dams coming out of the Klamath. He had never seen our dams. And so that was a real moment for me of like, my son will never see my river dammed, our river dammed. And that is a beautiful thing. And then to go back down there in September and to put my hands in the water on Chinook and to celebrate with him and to shed tears with him. Like, because I remember what that feels like. I remember the day that I saw salmon above where the dams were. It ignited the passion in me that we share that in common now. And like, we will forever be connected with the people of the Klamath because we have that in common.
That's so powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
It makes me think of like, it's different, but almost feels the same in that like, it made me think of working with, I used to work with Braveheart Society, and they've done a lot of really important work in South Dakota and across the plains on bringing back girls coming of age ceremonies. And one thing that they had shared with me that they learned kind of early on in the process is that it's so beautiful and moving to see young girls get to go through this after a century of it not happening, and for it to be normal to them and like a part of their adolescence, because it wasn't normal to so many generations. Like my generation didn't get to have that. But what they shared was that there was this simultaneous like joy that came from like reclamation and healing of something that's so critical to who we are as Indigenous women, but also that there was so much grief that the mothers and the grandmothers felt because they didn't get to have that and they're too old to have it now. And so they started offering, like parallel to the coming of age ceremonies for the younger girls, like grief ceremonies for the moms and grandmas so that they could process that loss and that trauma that was getting triggered by their daughters and granddaughters getting to have this beautiful experience.
Yeah, it's so necessary for us as the younger people leading the way now in this work, as our elders have stepped aside to become our knowledge keepers, right? To include them in the work that we're doing. And I was very thankful and blessed during our first ceremonial subsistence fishery, which was 2 years ago now. I caught my limit of fish in the first day. And so I went back to work and I said, how can I fish for my elders? How can I fish for the ones who can't get out there anymore? I was thankful that I had a position that I could go walk into the office and say, we need to create a regulation that says that we can have delegated fishers for our elders. And so we changed the regulations, and I was able to go out, and some of my cousins who got their limit were able to go out and hand deliver fish from our river that we live right next to. For the first time in 10 years, and watch them cry tears of healing. And so it's important to wrap those people into the work we're doing, even though they can't always be present.
That's so beautiful. I think the care that I'm learning, a lot from Annita, that Indigenous people have for multiple generations and the community as a whole is just something that is so powerful. And I hope continues to grow and be spread, because it's so kind.
So many people aren't aware of things like the Bolt decision or the fish wars. And I'm wondering if there's any of that kind of historical context that you'd like to share with us here.
I am the daughter of a woman who fought in the fish wars, and I am the granddaughter of a woman who fought in the fish wars. I think it's time for us to start telling the truth about those things with our allies, because even now, in this day, when we reopened the Elwha River for ceremonial and subsistence fishery, that misinformation reared its ugly head about what happened during the fish wars and the Bolt decision, about the regulation of fisheries, about the way that our tribal fisheries are managed. So much is unknown by the general public that often they scapegoat tribes and tribal fisher people as the reason the fish is declining. And our fisheries are so heavily regulated. I come from a very small tribe, a tribe of like 870 people. And they're blaming us for the reason the fish are gone from the Elwha, because they want to get out and fish for sport. And we would love that if there were enough fish for everybody. That is the goal. When we fight for the fish, for the people, we're not just fighting for us and our future generations. We're fighting for everybody, for fish for everyone. We would love to stand in the river again with our co-managers and all of the general public and have enough fish for everyone. The tribes are leading the way and doing the work with restoration. At the same time, we're being blamed for the loss of fish in the Pacific Northwest.
Could you expand on the fish wars?
Yeah, so there were two different fish wars. There were the fish wars in the Klamath and the fish wars in the Pacific Northwest Puget Sound area. Essentially, fishing was made illegal even though it was a retained treaty right. When we signed the treaties, my treaty was the Treaty of 1855, point no point. We retained the right to fish at our usual and accustomed areas. So then after that, when we signed our treaties, there was commercialization of fishing in the Pacific Northwest. There was a cannery built at the mouth of every river and every single harbor. They over-harvested, and they made it illegal, not on paper, but they enforced tribes from fishing. It was illegal for us to harvest fish. And they enforced it through, at the time, BIA agents came into our reservations and were holding us accountable, saying that we could not fish. So fishing was illegal for many years, and we still fished because we lived on the river, and that was our food system, our food security and food sovereignty. But we had to do it under darkness, and we had to have our children drag our fish back through a field so that the agents wouldn't see that there were fish behind them on a rope, to support our families. And it wasn't until Indigenous people started standing up and saying, we're fishing, this is our right, this is our treaty right. And they started finding their power within them to say, no, this is my reserve treaty right, this is what I'm going to do. And so they started these episodes of what they called fish-ins, where they visibly included media and invited a lot of people to these fishing, where they would set their net, rivers like the Puyallup River, the Nisqually River, and they would have agents show up, WDFW agents and police officers, and they would come and pull their nets out of the river and say they were fishing illegally. They would arrest them. Billy Frank Jr. was a big one. He, advocated for fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest for many years. It created an opportunity for us to step into court as treaty nations. There was a court ruling in Oregon that happened, and we kind of piggybacked here in Washington off of that, went to the Supreme Court, and what came out of that was the Bolt decision, which says that we are allowed 50% of the total catch after the returning run to supplement the population continuing, we're allowed 50% of the catch as tribes. And then that's divided up between the tribes, depending on the runs and the rivers that you are in your usual and accustomed area. So we go through a process to create our fisheries management through the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, north of Falcon, to create our management plans for the whole year, depending on run populations, estimates, all of those things, ocean conditions. And our fisheries are the highest regulated and enforced fisheries there are in the state. We have one enforcement officer for every 10 fishermen and women here at my tribe. And when you look at the state fisheries, it's a lot different. They have a lack of enforcement, right? The way that they're doing things is a lot different. It's more of a trust system.
Appreciate you expanding on that. I think our listeners, want to have the full background, and no one better to hear it from than you.
I think people don't realize there is such a direct link between the environmental politics that we're talking about and the kind of broader landscape of violence against Indigenous people. And the Pacific Northwest is a hotspot for that. Washington has one of the highest rates by state in the country, or here on the Klamath River, Humboldt and Trinity counties have, and Del Norte counties have extremely high rates of violence against Indigenous people. And I think there is a direct link between the kind of like misinformation, bias, resentment, anger that gets misplaced onto Native people when it comes to things like salmon politics, and the kind of casual violence and racism that happens in these places too.
I hope by doing things like this, it creates a conversation to be had, right? And it gets people asking questions so that they can start to ask more questions and understand in better depth what tribal people either are facing or what tribal treaty rights and management looks like. If we can start a conversation, I think that's the way how we all begin to heal as a society, fishing alongside one another.
And I think it's a reminder that Native or not, we all benefit from tribal governance of resources like salmon, because tribes are so thoughtful and careful and have such deep relationships with those animals that, they're our non-human relatives. They're not something that we're going to exploit or harm, and, want to be in a healthy relationship with. And everyone on the river, Native or not, benefits from that. Vanessa, I'd love to hear from you kind of in that vein, what a good relationship would be between the conservation world and Indigenous peoples, and like what respectful conservation looks like when it's done in a good way, led by or in partnership with Indigenous peoples.
I think that I'm firsthand experiencing that right now with the role that I carry at Panthera. They're a non-Indigenous led conservation organization. And through the work that I do with my supervisor, he recognized, working with tribes, that he wanted to invest in tribal people and Indigenous people and traditional ecological knowledge. And he knew that we were the first scientists of this land. And he constantly reminded me that I was a scientist, regardless of if I have a degree or not, that I am a scientist because I am an Indigenous person. I think that there's a lot to learn from that. And I respect Dr. Margell Brock so much because of the way that he is a good ally, the way he is committed. My position, thankfully, was created so that they could replicate it in other communities where they work with Indigenous people. And so it's allowing me to lay the groundwork with how a worldwide organization operates in traditional territories, which is huge because that's an impact, right? With conservation organizations, I think the best thing that they could do is make connections first, obviously with Indigenous populations and Indigenous communities, Indigenous nonprofits that are already doing the work, and see how they can support them in the work that they're doing, and not being afraid to step aside and being humble about that and saying, you know what, they're doing the work, this Indigenous people are doing the work, we're going to stand behind them and promote them and promote their message and allow them to lead the way. If the non-Indigenous conservation groups have a platform, using that and letting Indigenous people use that for the greater good. A lot of the times we have to find common ground with different organizations. And a lot of the times we don't see eye to eye on everything, and that's okay. And understanding that we can put those other things away as long as we're fighting for the same thing and we have a common ground, making sure that that's what we're doing for the greater good of, like, for instance, salmon. There's a lot of partners in the Snake River campaign that don't agree on a lot of things, but what they do agree on is that they need their salmon back. So how do you put all that aside and lead forward with how do we get our salmon back? And uplifting the Indigenous voices and saying, we're going to let you lead this because this is your homelands. You know what's best.
I've heard routinely from non-Native colleagues since joining into like conservation work is that the reminder that not all tribes agree and that not all tribes have the same perspective on how to do things. And that's 1,000% true. But also that like we have practices of diplomacy that are thousands of years old. So even when we don't agree, we know how to work through it in a good way. And you got to step back and let us figure it out because we have processes that work.
I don't speak for my tribe, or I'm an Indigenous woman. I speak for myself and my family. Even if you have one Indigenous person's perspective, that doesn't mean you have a community of Indigenous people's perspective or a tribe's opinion. Making sure that you're making more than just one connection and your obligation to the community or the organization in general. It's hard as an Indigenous person stepping into the world of conservation and to not allow myself to be tokenized. That is something that I really struggled with. And like making sure that the people that I shook hands with and that I'm in a room with have good intentions and are walking in a good way with me. And making sure those are the people that I'm holding space with. Because it's so often that our people are tokenized because they're checking a box, right? And making sure that if you are working with Indigenous people, that's not what they are to you.
That's definitely something I've experienced too. And I think every Native person has at some point, especially if you're working in a, in a career field that's not in tribal communities specifically, like navigating the challenges between like on the one hand knowing that Indigenous people are underrepresented in this space, especially Indigenous women, and like being really strong in that identity and wanting to represent that and wanting to advocate for our peoples, but on the other hand not wanting to be that token and not wanting to be the person. Like I think there's some people that get comfortable being the only Native in the room, and not wanting to be that person either.
So one thing that I make sure that I always do is I come with my message. I don't allow other people to write the message for me. I make sure that I'm telling my story, my message, and I have my agenda, and I'm not letting other people silence my agenda for Indigenous people, for Indigenous rights, for environmental rights, for ecological systems, all of those things, all the animals that don't have a voice. But I'm also including our youth. Every time I go and speak somewhere, I have 2 or 3 youth coming with me. And I bring them with me and they stay in the hotel room with me and I invite them because I want them to hold space too. And I want them to know that they belong there at these seats and that this is possible to build these relationships. And now at this point, people know that I roll with a posse, right? Like I have all these Indigenous youth with me. I'm like, these are my little chicks. And like,
Love it.
and I just want them to, I am so excited for the next generation of youth, Indigenous youth coming up. It's exciting to me to see the capabilities that they have. And like for us and the people before me have blazed the way for us, right? Like there have been so many people. I don't ever claim to be the first in this world. There have been so many before us that led the way and that allowed us to hold space in these arenas.
I love that. And well, and that must come from your experience in child welfare too. Like, can you speak to, I know you made the transition from, being in Indian child welfare to now doing land-based work. Maybe share a little bit about that.
Yeah. So for many years, I was in Indian child welfare. And the reason I went into Indian child welfare was because my mother and her siblings were all removed under the 50 scoop. They were removed from the Indigenous community. They were sent into Catholic foster care. They were raised not on their reservation with no knowledge or connection with their people. And so my mom made the conscious decision when she had children to move us back to the reservation because she wanted us to grow up with what she didn't have, which was a sense of identity of who she was. And so when I grew up and realized like all of the things and all the traumas that my mom had faced at the hands of this organization, the systemic organization that was created to rip that away from us, from the culture. And then learning about the Indian Child Welfare Act, I was like, that is what I want to do. I want to heal our people. I want to make sure they don't steal our children anymore. I want to make sure to hold the state accountable. I want to make sure that they're following ICWA, all of those things. And so I did. And that was really healing for me and my family. And to return children to the reservation out of non-native foster care was the best thing. And to get more houses or more families licensed on the reservation so that they could take in more children, and building like kinship ties and family ties and creating cultural contact agreements with. And then I got to work on the state ICWA. And that was heart heavy work. That was something I went through, so much burnout because I had 60 cases or more at a time. And it really took a toll on myself, on my health. And I knew that I couldn't do it forever. And so there was a massive event that shifted everything for me. Was Standing Rock happened in North Dakota. And I decided to go. And because I was a woman with no children at the time, and everybody I knew wanted to go, but they couldn't because they had family obligations and other things. And I was like, well, I can go. And so I did. I went. And during my 6 months at Standing Rock, I really took to heart when they said, now take this sacred fire home and light it in your own community and continue fighting for your water and your people and your resources. And having the past that I had growing up as a fisherwoman on the river, I came home and I immediately was like, I wonder what's going on with our river. We haven't fished in 10 years. Like, where are our fish? What's going on? And so then I started digging into like, this is what I want to do. I want to find out what's going on with our river, and I want to see how I can heal my people through the environmental work, and then finding out where are our fish, where are our relatives. And that was the day that I started my healing journey, was stepping foot in that river and seeing those fish and handling those fish and relearning the river, because it had completely changed. Like physically, it had changed course. It was braided throughout the territory. Our beach is completely different. The sediment load that came down and landed on our beach, we have this beautiful sandy beach now, which also changed the composition of life underwater in the near shore. And so that was when my healing started, was when I became a natural resource technician. And at the same time, I knew that they were both important work, because when we heal our people, we heal our earth. And when we heal specifically our Indigenous women, we heal our earth.
I think that's so powerful. And I think Annita and I have had so many conversations about the healing ability of being in, water. I also grew up around water as well. So like being in water is just something that is so healing to so many people, and trying to encourage more women and, people in general to get out and spend time in the outdoors and feel that healing for themselves.
I didn't realize what that would even do for me. I mean, I had hiked before, but like actually physically getting into the water. And it returned me to my roots, because I grew up knowing, like in our culture, we winter bathe all winter long. We go and get in the water. And that's what started my journey with reconnecting to that spirituality, that practice. Like at first it was me and my waders, and then it was me in a dry suit. And then I was like going to the water even on my weekends and getting into the water. And like that is what ignited that. Was like I was doing it at work, and then I was like, you know what? This is who I am. And so I started practicing that spiritually, and now I'm doing it on a regular basis to make sure I'm taking care of myself.
I so relate to that, having transitioned into this field from being an advocate for victims as well. And like, I can't tell you the number of times that I would get called to help a family in the wake of, like I mostly worked on murder cases. So I'd get called to help with the funeral and hold space for them for that process. When you do that every day for years, like it takes such a toll on you. And I think it's so interesting to see how many of us have gone from that work to this land based work as a way of healing ourselves from that burnout, but also redirecting that healing energy that I think we're all called to give our communities, in a way that feels more nurturing, to us as well.
I had no idea that there were so many women like me that had made that shift. And it's so beautiful to see both you and our friend in common that have done that shift from social work to, or the people work to the earth work.
If you could expand on that and just share why you think it's important that us as women, especially us as Indigenous women, are, active in the conservation movement and active in its leadership.
I come from a matriarchal society where our women historically were the decision makers of our communities. And I come from a long line of activist women who have fought for the water and the salmon and all living things from contact on. And, it was my great aunt and my great great aunt who went to DC to testify when I was little for the Elwha Act to be passed. And I think that in our communities, because we are the givers of life, we find and feel like this profound responsibility to continue taking care of Mother Earth because we are the mothers of our communities. And, we're in a time where I have seen a shift to where people are paying attention to our traditional ecological knowledge, our traditional Indigenous knowledge, to where scientists are seeking us Indigenous people out for advice because we've been saying these things for a long time. Our generations of people have been saying, this is what's happening, this is what's going to happen, and this is why. And it wasn't until those connections are made between Western science and traditional ecological knowledge that now they're paying attention. And so I've seen a movement of elevating Indigenous voices into this world and a movement of young Indigenous people getting educated in the Western world of science and learning how to braid those two things. And I think it's super important to continue as an Indigenous woman just because of that profound inherent genetic responsibility that we are the mothers, we are the caretakers. And at least that's for my family and I'm sure other tribal communities, but that's my profound feeling like this is my responsibility as a steward of this land who has been here since time immemorial.
I love that. That's so real and so powerful. And definitely, feel it. And I think also important in that is that Indigenous ideas of motherhood are so much more expansive than Western ideas. Motherhood includes, grandmas, aunties. It's just such a different experience. I was trying to explain to someone I'm 33, but I have two grandsons. I don't have biological kids, but I have nieces with babies. So I have two grandbabies now. So I think that speaks to your point too, is that our understanding of kinship, is so much more expansive and includes the land in that way too.
Yeah, our relationships. I always say also that when we talk about keystone species in the scientific world, that we have to remember as Indigenous people that we are a keystone species in the ecosystem, that we were managing these lands since time immemorial. But also, our families are so intricate, compared to the Western idea of what family is biologically. My family tree, I always say it's a family bush because it's so connected, or the vines in between all the branches, right? And yeah, you're right. I'm an auntie to hundreds. And that's beautiful because, that means I'm a role model. And I take that really as a responsibility.
Well, thank you so much for all you do for the conservation world, for Indigenous peoples, for on a personal note, Klamath River has a special place in my heart. So thank you for what you're doing for the climate. And thank you for your time on the podcast today. It's just been a beautiful conversation. And I feel like I could talk your ear off for hours, but I want to respect your time.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here. I raise my hands to both of you. And, thank you for the invitation and allowing me to hold space with you. I'm excited for what you guys are doing.
Today's podcast was edited by Tanner Saul. For more details about the episode, don't forget to check the show notes.